Now, who can tell me what this means? Primogenitor. Pardon me? Who said it?
Inheritance. You inherit your land, all of it. The oldest son.
The oldest son inherits the land. That right there is the fundamentals for Deep South culture, right there. And primogeniture is something you're going to talk about all the way through our visit here tonight. And because you were right, I'm going to give you a book. There's somebody in here, wasn't it? Right here. Oh, you don't even look that smart. I hope you enjoy that. You're right. Primogeniture. I don't know about the Bible. I never read it. I saw the movie. And he wasn't in there, I don't think. Primogeniture, that goes way back. If I was an attorney, I could take an hour and a half telling you about all the complications of the firstborn and their right to property. But as far as we go, primogeniture is the word that you'll see it come up again and again and again all night. And it's the fundamentals of Deep South culture. And when you walk out of here tonight, you're going to go, oh, now I understand what that guy was talking about. The fundamentals of Deep South culture. The firstborn. The Goose Creek Men, the founding fathers of Deep South, landed in Carolina in 1670. Was that 350 years ago? And they pushed inland to claim soil along Goose Creek. On that first ship that put the anchor in right off Charleston, it came from England to Barbados and then to Carolina. And at that time, Barbados had the reputation of being the richest colony in the English Empire, English-speaking world. And it also had the reputation of being the most horrendous colony in the English-speaking world. So we had a mixture of people on that first ship, and more of them came in subsequent months and years. More and more came, and they didn't stay down by, here's Barbados right over here. I'll give you an idea of where it's located. And you can see it looks like a little lima bean there. And it's sitting there among all the other English islands, sugar islands. And they didn't stay right there in Charleston. And why didn't they stay in Charleston? Because there's no water you can drink. It's all salt water. And there's very few animals that can live on marsh, on salt marsh. Some can, like the marsh tacky, our state horse. It eats the marsh tack, the marsh. But you really couldn't make much of it. So they pushed inland until they got to the first fresh water, the first body of fresh water, and that was something that later on they named Goose Creek. It's about 22 miles long, and they settled on both sides of the creek. They brought that slave system with them from Barbados, and they overwhelmed the entire colony with that Barbadian culture that diffused into North Carolina and Georgia, and by extension, it eventually tainted all the southern colonies. This is really interesting because this is the picture of the Goose Creek Men. It's the only picture I've ever seen of the Goose Creek Men. Has anybody in here ever seen a painting or a statue or anything of Goose Creek Men? They're the founding fathers of the Deep South, but I've never seen it. This is the only thing that I had ever saw, and so I was trying to get permission to use it. And I heard that it was up at a founding father. It was there it is, Ocmulgee Mounds. It's a federal park north of Macon, Georgia. And I heard from somewhere that was there. And I needed permission to use the image, so I called up there to get permission, and nobody could tell me where it was. They said, we never saw anything like that. And I even talked to the director, and she said, I don't know what you're talking about, Mr. Heitzler. We don't have anything about Goose Creek Men anywhere. And then she called me back the next day and she said, I found it. It's in the foyer to our library here at the Ocmulgee. And because it's a federal image, I have the right to use it without having to get copyright and do all that business. And so I feel really proud of Ocmulgee Mounds. Now look at these guys. Right here on the left is James Moore. He was the troublemaker for about 50 years. He ended up being the governor, and then his son took over as governor. You'll learn more about him. On the other side is an Indian by the name of Watery Jack. We don't have time tonight to talk about Watery Jack. We could have a whole evening of talking about him. He's probably the most incredible personality that I stumbled across in doing this research. And this guy, author M. Eugene Sermons, said the Goose Creek Men were primarily interested in dominating South Carolina so they could build fortunes in any way possible. James Moore, Watery Jack, and that is what you call a diorama. It was like the little characters, and they're in front of a painting. And the painting shows all the Indians that were in long lines that they were dragging out of the mounds area, and they were taking them to Charleston to sell down to the Caribbean. Why didn't they just use the Indians here in South Carolina to be their slaves? Who wants to win a book? Why didn't we just keep them here? Why did we ship them all the way down to the Caribbean and then import Africans?
They didn't know how to
They
play.
knew where to run back to.
What?
They didn't know how to play.
Where to run back to.
Yes, did I give you a book already? Let other people answer. They could just walk off if they wanted to and they'd go home. You couldn't keep them. You couldn't keep them in the field. You're exactly right, sir. But let other people answer.
I want another book.
Okay, well, you know, I'm going to give you that. I do have another one there. Okay. Anyway, the fundamentals of Deep South culture were conceived in England, born in the Caribbean, and reared from its cradle in Goose Creek, South Carolina. What do you think about Southern culture? I don't know who you people are. I just mentioned tonight. Some of y'all might be from the South. Some of y'all might be from the North. Some of y'all might love that Confederate flag and want to wrap it around you and get all warm and cozy. And others want to spit on it, throw it down in the mud and step on it. And most everybody is somewhere in between. But you must admit that Southern culture is still a part of our culture, whether we like it or not. Just what, yesterday or the day before, I read in the paper where they were suing about getting the John C. Calhoun statue put back up or whatever. Every day there's something about racial issues or something that has to do with culture, the Southern culture that still follows us through our life, whether we like it or not. And we all have different levels and extremes of application of it. Conceived in England. What do I mean that Southern culture was conceived in England? This guy, William the Conqueror, defeated the English in the Battle of 1066. And it was such a big deal back then that they did a bateau tapestry that was 230 feet long, almost as long as a football field, trying to explain the dynamics of that battle of 1066 when William the Conqueror conquered all of England. Look at that. He conquered all of England and said, England is mine, all of it. And you can't have any of it unless I give it to you. And then I'll give you this, I'll give you that. To his friends and to his relatives, he gave pieces of England away. But he kept what they call a Norman yoke on all the tribes of England. If you were a tribesman, you could own no land. The land was passed down to the oldest son. It was called primogeniture. And if you were a peon, if you were not a relative of the king, or if you're not a close friend of the king, you didn't get any land. You had no rights, no ability, no freedom to vote for anything or have a say in anything. All you could do is work for the man. You were a slave, a peon, a peasant, whatever you wanted to be called. So that's what he established. And William's lands were divided after he died. Normandy down in Europe, down here on main base of Europe, went to his second son of England, his eldest son, Robert, and William got England. William was a so-called second son. Primogeniture preserved the aristocracy. It'll always be the second son, and there's no excuse. You can't say, well, we're going to have the land, but it's going to go to the second son now, since the guy died, but we're going to let the mom, let her have the house. No, you can't do it. It's against the law. Well, let's let Uncle Pete have the orchard because you love that apple orchard. No, it's against the law. The whole place, no exception, entail was the law, had to go to the eldest son. And you'll see how this plays into Deep South culture. And there was no exceptions to it. Landed gentry resulted from primogeniture and entail. Now, why did we have that Norway and Sweden and all? Why were they into the second son business, the primogeniture business? I don't know. I don't have a clue. But I know that England did it. Richard of Lineheart, the famous second son, couldn't take it. You know, back when I was in college, back in the 60s, there was some studies going on called the birth order study. Remember those? They would test people to find out what kind of personalities they had and all that, and then find out whether they're the firstborn, the secondborn, or thirdborn. The firstborn was obeyed the rules, right? Remember that? The second born was a troublemaker. The rules are not for me. And the third and the fourth are little spoiled guys and girls. They were spoiled. Remember that? It was very interesting. I thought, I didn't understand it at the time, but it plays right into this culture business, the Southern culture. Because Richard the Lionheart didn't want to obey the rules, and he was a second son. He was not going to inherit anything. When he was 16 years old, he was in charge of the kingdom's defense. He was such a virulent, aggressive, angry young man. At 16, he was in charge of the defense of the kingdom. But it wasn't good enough, so he went on a crusade. Matter of fact, he went on 3 crusades. And when he came back, he brought back with him the symbol of the crescent moon. Why? So that's the symbol of the Near East. That's where the crusade took place. The crescent moon. He wore it right here on his heraldry. Heraldry is what they called it. You would put it on like it was maybe like a football jersey. It has your number, the name of the team, the colors, or maybe like a military rank, you know, your medals and your pins and your ribbons and how long you've been, what your rank you were. Back then, if you were royalty, if you were a peasant, you didn't have any armor. If you were royalty, you had armor and you had a heraldry you would wear over you. Remember me doing this, because he does something, later on we're going to see something else right here in this heraldry, and you're going to go, I'll be darned. But he wore that heraldry, and it was that crescent from the crescent moon. And why do you say, there it is, it's a crescent with a star over the top. Do you know of anything that, other than a crescent moon, do you know of a crescent something else? Pardon me? It's a surprise. That comes later. I'll give you a book though.
State flag.
What?
The state flag.
Yes, that's the crescent on our state flag. But can you think of something that is shaped like that is not a crescent?
A croissant.
Sickle? A croissant. Now that's being silly. You're one. Okay, blame it on her. A croissant. Yeah. A sickle, that's a good one. Never thought of a sickle before, but that's a good one. But it means the symbol of the ancient moon god of the Near East, and he wore it right there when he went back home. Look at the old art, some of the old elements from ancient Near East. You see that? I think I have a light on here somewhere. You see the top one has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 stars around the crescent. In other places, the crescent has 1 star. Down here, it has a star in the back, just a crescent in the background. And then look at all the countries over there today. Not all of them, but a whole lot of the countries in the Near East today have the crescent. And that crescent goes back 2,000 years. It's the ancient symbol of the Near East. The crescent moon became the symbol of the second son. See it up there, that crescent? Because he brought it back, and he was a famous second son. He did not have the right to inherit the kingdom, but he was going to get his way anyway. And people began to wear it, even if they were the third, fourth son, or the fifth son, they began to wear that crescent on their heraldry because it represented not just the second son, it represented royalty. And if you were royal, you had everything. And it represented authority. Southern culture was conceived in England. Any questions about that? Does that make sense that it came out of England, the Southern culture? And was born in the Caribbean. King encouraged younger sons to go to the Caribbean. Sir William Berkeley was a what do you call it, starts with a P, proprietor? No. Proprietor, yes it was. Is that it, proprietor? Proprietor, okay. I don't have enough books for you. The Norman culture planted in the mature islands of the Caribbean. The second sons of England settled the Caribbean islands. I like that map. Born in the Caribbean, the Scots, the Irish, the Native Americans, the Africans were enslaved in Barbados, the most horrendous colony in the English-speaking world. James the First of England, the guy that he got about 50 scholars to write the Bible, the King James Version of the Bible, which we still use today. He also said, maybe I have it up, yeah. He also said, root out the papists. We'll go to Ireland and root out the papists. Then fill it with Puritans. Then seal it. That means get the Catholics out of there, bring the Protestants in, and then keep it like that. Don't let it. They're still having trouble with Catholics over there. Right? I don't know. They're a pain in the neck. I'm a Catholic, I know. The Filipinos run my church, you know, what am I doing here? No, I love it. I love it. We have a good, but yeah, he said root out the Papists. So what did he do? He sent the army in. He got these Irish men, women, and children, and sent 50,000 of them to work on the islands in the Caribbean, to work on those sugar islands. Now, there's some arguments and there's some discussion about this. They did that because African slaves were so expensive. They were so much more expensive than the Irish at that time. Plus, you had to get rid of these Irish. The king said, get them out of there, kill them, or get them out of there. So they had thousands and thousands of Irish that were sent into the sugar islands. Make them work out there. And even if they bred with the women, or the English bred Irish women with Africans for profit because the African was so expensive and such an important source of labor. Children of slaves increased the master's workforce. Even if an Irish woman somehow obtained her freedom, her children remained slaves. Between 1652 and 1659, over 50,000 Irish were transported from Ireland to the West Indies. Now, see that? Now, do they still use those words today over there? In Barbados they do? Have you been to Barbados? Okay, because I asked, have you been to Barbados?
Long time ago, yeah.
Well, do you recognize this? Where they call them poor whites, red shanks, poor Bakra Johnny, redneck, baked neck. Today they're called red legs. Did they call them that when you were there? Well, see these guys down here, they're not slaves. These guys are fishermen right here, okay? They're not slaves. This picture was taken around 1900. So not to be confused with a picture of slaves, although there was a bunch of slaves over there. These little girls here, this has probably been about the same time too. Poor whites, poor Bakra Johnny, Icky Picky, poor backward Johnny, poor whites from below the hill. Any white mice or Beckelek, baked neck. Well, I made friends with the Secretary of State from Barbados and the President of Barbados. I wouldn't say we're friends. We met and we talked a couple times. And I would ask him a question. I said, are you still talking like that and calling these people these things? He said, no, Mike. He said, that's a long time ago. You know, every now and then somebody will goof around and they don't talk like that. But they're just goofy. I said, now listen to this. I said, well, if I go to Barbados, will I have an opportunity to talk to some of the redlegs? Because he called them redlegs. He still calls them redlegs. And I called them redlegs. Can I meet with some of these redlegs? And he said, yeah, they come into town on the weekends. Well, think about that. What do you mean they come into town on the weekends? He said they make their stuff and bring it in on the weekends to sell it in the cities. The redlegs. So I said redlegs, and he did too. So that doesn't seem to be an offensive word. Plus, they must be segregated because they came in on the weekends. I mean, to sell themselves. And he didn't see anything wrong with that. And while I'm at it, I've got to remember, I couldn't think about how they could make all that sugar cane down there and become so wealthy. And they don't have any rivers, there's no lakes, there's no streams, there's no source of water except out of the sky. But you all know about sugar cane. It absorbs that water into its shell. The whole thing becomes a what? Stalk. The whole, I can't remember stuff, thanks. The whole stalk becomes full of water. And he says we have plenty of rain and we don't have to depend on that. So I thought that was interesting too. But look at those cute little girls. They're not slave girls, but the little Irish girls. They called bound workers redlegs, and in 1689, the governor of Barbados, James Kendall, said the Irish redlegs were used like dogs. And here's some of the Irish redlegs today. But they go into the town on weekends to sell their stuff. Interesting, isn't it? And Barbados was part of the British Empire, part of the British Commonwealth, up until just a few years ago, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, they became an independent country. But you know how sensitive we are about words and names that we call people. You know, don't always be very appropriate with name calling and stuff. Over there, it's very common. Today's redlegs. The richest colony in the English-speaking world. Look at their map. And look at what a section of the map. Go ahead and kill some of them slaves if you want to. Don't let them get away. That's their map. That's my favorite map. The Barbadian reputation prompted the renowned philosopher John Locke to warn, the Barbadians endeavor to rule all. The Barbadian, I'll go back. I forgot, I'll just read it to myself. The acreage in Barbados began to get used up, and so they started looking for other places to settle and farm, and they ended up coming up here to the Carolina, where we had plenty of land and plenty of fresh water around Goose Creek. And they united politically to become known as the Goose Creek Men. This is the road they took to go up from Charleston, across the Goose Creek Bridge that was finally built there, and then finally all the way up towards Monk's Corner. The grand estates along Goose Creek provided a cradle where Deep South culture spawned in North America. These are this is just some of the manor houses that I got images of to share with you, because I ended up finding 83 different plantations in the St. James Goose Creek Parish. This is not in the parish. The parish starts in the middle of the Cooper River there. You guys missed it. But in the area that I studied, St. James Goose Creek Parish, I found 83. You saw the book that was in there, 83 different plantations. And I don't know if it's true, but I think every plantation had a manor house. So you can see the oaks and what their house looked like. It's burned down now, it's taken down, but it used to be right there in Goose Creek. Otranto. For example, the second son, have you ever heard of Benjamin Middleton? You have? Not really, not really.
The Middleton Plantation.
But that's not Benjamin. No. Have you heard of Benjamin Middleton? No. So he was trying to get a free book. But he's trying, you know. Benjamin Middleton was the oldest son. So his son went to Barbados to get a plantation because he couldn't get his own. He named his oldest son Benjamin. Benjamin got that, but his second and third son was Henry and Edward. Henry came to Otranto. Edward came to the Oaks. So you can see how the oldest son business worked out. The elms.
How many acres typically?
Oh, typically, I've seen plantations as small as 400 acres, and I've seen some as large as 6,000. Good question. I hadn't thought about that. I might change my mind before the evening's out, too. I'm thinking maybe, okay. This is my favorite picture here. This is a wreckage. This was taken about 1930. See the little boy sitting there? He's kind of modeling, giving you some perspective. The elms. Crowfield. The haze. I hope you can hear. I'm sorry, I keep getting away from my mic. It's better if you can't hear me, I think. Oh, the haze. I found the haze on this map. Yeah. You see it right there? Yep. So they took the name of the plantation from the Sugar Islands and they brought it and they implanted it right here in Goose Creek, or in the Goose Creek area. This is over on the Ashley River. Mulberry Castle. And here I got this just for y'all to see Daniel up there on B. Well, I had this in my file. I had gone and identified where the plantations were on the Cooper River that were part of the Goose Creek Men, because although just the people along Goose Creek formed that political party called the Goose Creek Men, eventually plantation owners on the freshwater, up above the freshwater of the Cooper River began to join that political group because they had a lot of power, a lot of influence. And Daniel, his name was Robert Daniel or Richard? Robert Daniel, right there, B. So it went through A through K. And here was another one. Here's Daniel right there. That's who's Dean Hall. That's just an example. Have y'all been to Dean Hall in Berkeley County near Monk's Corner? Please go. You'd love it. You'd love it there. And you won't forget the experience. Medway Plantation, the oldest house in South Carolina. It's in Goose Creek. Proud of that. Drayton Hall. And then settlers arriving from every island in the English Caribbean, and I got them in different colors. You can see the red came from Barbados, including Daniel. And then you had the blue came from Antigua, And then the last of the red there was the Woodward and Nevis Islands. And then here's a map that just has a bunch of those names of those plantation owners on it. Some of the earliest plantations that we had was guys that names that I never can remember, like Shrinkin. You ever hear of Shrinkin? It's right the first one you come up to when you cross the Goose Creek Bridge is Shrinkin's plantation. I don't know who in the world he was. The Goose Creek Men earned a vile reputation. Commissary Gideon Johnson wrote, the Goose Creek men, generally speaking, are the vilest race of men upon the earth, transporting themselves hither from Bermuda, Jamaica, Barbados, Montserrat, Antigua, Nevis. They are the most factious and sedacious people in the whole world. Now that sounds really pretty bad. What does factious mean? I got a book for you. What?
Argumentative.
Argumentative. Okay, get a book before you leave, okay? Argumentative. I didn't know. I really didn't know. Factious. Argumentative. I know some factious people. James Moore and Watery Jack, they were right here are showing ahead of returning from Florida and we're bringing slaves back. You can see the stretch behind them. And you see how cleverly they made that walking path, how deep it is? Like it's been many, many, many feet on that path over the years. The commissary was informed of lewd and debauched practices during this excursion, some of whom were guilty of such gross enormities as even the more modest heathens themselves had been ashamed. One native chief stated, Baccarat, white man, drunk grandly, me no love you that. And you all do history. You do your own history and you do your own research, and don't you just love it when you find something like this? My gosh, you stumble across it. It's in somebody's day book or somewhere. It's really exciting. Yes, sir.
Who decided who got what land?
The proprietor. And then the governor, the proprietor authorized the governor. The governor would really, the proprietor was back in England most 99% of the time, so the governor would make the decision. Then they would send the surveyor out there, and the surveyor would survey it out. And my favorite surveyor is Maurice Matthews. We're going to mention him here in a minute. He would go out and draw up the plat of the new plantations, and he had a day book. And one day he wrote, and when he was drawing out this plantation, he would list the name of Goose Creek. He would call it A-T-H-A-N, Athen. So we have some streets in Goose Creek called Athen because they were, and trying to spell it A-C-H-A-U, spell it different ways. Finally, he said, it's the sound of the goose. And he started, because of the abundance of geese and other waterfowl. He wrote that in his day book. That was one of those moments I went, my God, because I could never find a true definition of who invented the name for Goose Creek and who came up with the name, where it came from. And the first book that I published in 1980, I made about 6 mistakes trying to explain that. I wish I could go back and throw that book away because it just had a lot of false information.
What year did you do that? What was it?
Oh, his year?
Yeah, I mean, like when you put that in there, so when it was.
So, 1690s. Yes, ma'am. Francis Lejeune, who was the minister of the St. James Goose Creek Church, he witnessed Goose Creek men driving slaves chained in long lines passing his parsonage on the way to be exported. The Goose Creek men for 50 years, controlled South Carolina, and they wrote a law and passed a law on how to manage slaves, and they treated slaves like they were an animal. The slaves had no more rights than an animal. Now, an animal, a cow, is valuable, and a slave is even more valuable, but they didn't have more rights. Southern culture. The Carolina colony lay at the southern extreme of the British North America, and the unsettled landmass that later became Georgia buffered the English in Carolina from Spanish Florida and screened the French advancing from the Mississippi River. Each of those kingdoms, each of those world empires were fighting for the same piece of property. James Moore, leader of the Goose Creek Men, employed brutal, non-relenting militarism ahead of the European and native allies to overwhelm the indigenous tribes of Carolina backcountry, Georgia, and the huge swaths of Florida. I went up and got an old dissertation written back in the 50s about how did these guys, these white Caucasian guys in Goose Creek, how did they take over all the Indian tribes? How were they able to do that? They played one tribe against the other. And we're gonna trade you some mulch, we're gonna give you some gunpowder and some shot and a musket, and we're gonna trade you the same thing, but we want you to bring some slaves back. But you don't want to? Okay, well then when you run out of gunpowder, we're not gonna give you any more. We're gonna give it to him, and he's gonna come and get you as a slave. They played one tribe against the other, and this fellow that wrote that dissertation explained that to me very eloquently, and I believe it. They played one tribe against the other, and that's why 100 men on horseback from Goose Creek, the Goose Creek Men, were able to take over the entire state of South Carolina, and then took over all of Georgia and all of North Carolina. Am I running out of time yet? I'm going to run by here. He was really a wise guy. he was said, they said he had a soul as big as a mosquito. There he is, James Moore. They accused him of being Roger Moore, who was the leader of the Irish during the rebellion, and the English people hated Roger Moore. He was a horrible enemy of the English people. So he had a son, he called him Roger, named him Roger. What a smart aleck. He had another guy, they accused him of being a Yahoo of the party. Now tell me who a Yahoo is. There ain't no books, though. I had to go look it up. He's a character in the Old Testament, and he cut off all of his enemies' heads and stacked them up in a big pile at his gate. So he's hated. He's hated for that. Well, he had another child, another son. He called his son Yahoo. So he's a wise guy. Not only was he a ferocious fighter, he's a leader of the Southern culture that we're all understanding where it came from, and he was a wise guy too. The Yahoo of the party. The French. Okay, I try to have these little theories about they're not true all the time, and I can't make them work. But in my reading of this, of the research and the background and the big stories and the little stories of South Carolina during the colonial period, the French were much nicer to their slaves than the English. The Germans left over after the Revolutionary War, the Germans that stayed back, they were much, much nicer to their slaves. They even doled land out to their slaves and sold parcels to their slaves, where an Englishman would never even think of doing it. To this day, I'm kind of wondering, why was that difference? And the difference was primogeniture. They didn't have the primogeniture in France or in Germany. So they didn't look at a slave like an animal. They looked at a potential landowner. And I've never heard that in any course I ever took. Have you? It's kind of like a new idea that popped in my head. The idea of birthright, birth order, and where you came from. The French seem to be much more understanding and loving of all their workers. And when we didn't have any, up in New England, as soon as the Pilgrims and the Puritans got up there, they started building churches and building schools. We didn't have anybody like John Winthrop until 1695, and they got here in 1670, so that's not 25 years before we got a minister like that. And look at our church. I want to explain something to you. This is the St. James Goose Creek Church. This is the pulpit. The pulpit used to be over on the side, and the sounding board, there's still a hook in the church, used to be over on the side, so that when you walked in, the first thing you saw was the eloquent artwork and the heraldry of the King of England. The front of the church has the pelican, which is a sea bird that flies over the sea. And underneath the pelican, they had 5 hearts. And I didn't know what those 5 hearts were. They had flames coming out. But I had a guy there who had a doctorate in theology. I was giving him a little tour a few years ago, and he said, "Mike, I think they represent the 5 known continents of the day." So the English had this mindset of the worldwide mindset of control. So I ask you, how did England, I call it the 3 M's, missionaries, merchants, and then the military. How did England, a small country about the size of Alabama, how did they end up having the most productive and the most virile country in Africa, in South Africa?
Powerful Navy.
Powerful Navy, but how did they even get it set up? Okay, good. I don't take that away from you, but the missionary came first. The Navy didn't pull up somewhere and say, let's go in here and do it. The missionary first, then the merchant, when the missionary started trading, then the merchants, then they brought in law enforcement with the Navy. And not only did they have the South Africa as their, one of their colonial countries, India. They have a name for the rule in India. The Raj, yes, thank you. I spent 3 months studying in India and at their universities, and you know, they all speak English. They speak English better than I do over there. And they have Indian culture, I mean, they have English culture. And then Hong Kong. When was it that Hong Kong became part of China again? It was part of England, Commonwealth? Just 99? Okay. And then after Hong Kong, it was Australia. Then after Australia, they had another continent called North America that took over. How did England do that? The answer is primogeniture. Remember I said that was going to be the answer? Because they had the oldest sons, they were restless, and they had to go somewhere else. They couldn't get land back home. You had to go get it somewhere else. Thomas Walrich, he wrote a poem, Barbados Isle inhabited by slaves, and for one honest man, 10,000 knaves, religion to these a romantic story. Barbarity and ill-got wealth, thy glory. So the manor house, the proprietor, the royalty, the nobleman, there was a royalty in South Carolina, and the noblemen would never go to a tavern, they would always just go to each other's houses. And can't read all this to you. Oh, so this is when they started criticizing the proprietors for not, and the king for not building churches and schools. They were a bunch of hypocrites. So they ended up having a revolution and taking over the government. And their complaint was, we're not building any schools, you're not building churches, you're leaving it all up to us, so we're just going to take you over. That was just their cheap excuse. And the sons of the original Goose Creek Men invented the West Indian type slave culture in North Carolina. And you know, the Holy Family that they said you could not break up the family, it had to stay whole and stay together. James Moore had 5 kids. He divided, when he died in his will, his land went to 5 directions. He had 2 daughters and 3 sons. The 3 sons went to North Carolina, and they got their separate plantations up there. The 2 daughters had dowries. One went to Somerville to marry a man Waring. They got their mayor's name Waring now, I guess. And anyway, what am I talking about? I forgot. And the family dominated North Carolina. That's what I was trying to say. The idea was to keep your plantation together, make sure the oldest son gets it, and you never divide it up. It has to stay whole. It has to be entailed. Have to stay whole. They finally just broke it all up, and they got land in North Carolina. They kept land down here. They got land in North Carolina, and then they moved to Georgia and got land in Georgia. He didn't even obey his own rules. This is when they took over Georgia. I know I'm running out of time here. And then the symbol of the crescent became the symbol of royalty, the symbol of authority, the symbol of the law. 2 of the regiments wore blue with the crescent. It's a little blurry for some reason. The Swamp Flocks had it. And General William Moultrie, I got real excited when I was reading his autobiography. He wrote about the Revolutionary War and when he made the flag. He said he mentioned the word heraldry, and he said he put the crescent in the upper dexter. Now, what does dexter mean?
Corner. Right.
Corner, but dexter means
Right.
right. Who said right? Okay, you get a book. You get a book, okay? I got some more over here, I think. I got more in my car. So he said the upper dexter, which is on the right. So if you're looking at the flag, it's over on the left. But if you hold it like heraldry, like over you, like your heraldry, then it's on the upper right dexter. That's how he made the flag. It was the blue from the uniforms, and the crescent from what they wore on their hat. The crescent was the authority that Richard the Lionheart brought back from the Near East. So you're worshiping the ancient moon god of the Near East every time you praise the South Carolina flag. But don't tell anybody, that just stays in here, okay? All right, I think I'm about done. Here he is, the crescent with a large blue flag made with a crescent in the dexter corner to be in uniform with the troops. And there it is. And I love ours. I think we got the best flag in the whole country. Which flag do you think is better than our state flag? Yeah, you better not say that. But really, it is a pretty cool flag, isn't it? And it has a pretty cool history to it if you get to know the history. So the fundamentals of Deep South culture were conceived in England. How was it conceived in England? Okay, the oldest son, so you had the royalty class. Everybody else under the royalty was nothing. You were a slave, you're a peasant, you're a peon. That idea came from England, born in the Caribbean, based on slavery. Slaves had no rights. And reared from his cradle in Goose Creek. They took that culture that they got from Barbados, they took it to the waters of Goose Creek waterways, then they went inland and took over all of Carolina, all of North Carolina, all of Georgia, before their time was up. And I think that's it. That's it. Okay. Thank you very much.
Does anybody have any questions for Michael? Anybody?
Yes, ma'am.
I heard that Goose Creek was originally called Yeaman's Creek. You know when that was?
Yes, ma'am, but it wasn't called Yeaman's Creek very long or by very many people.
Okay.
Yeaman's plantation was on a place on the creek where it took a gooseneck turn. So they even called the plantation Goose Creek Plantation for a while, okay? And some people said that's where the name came from the gooseneck turn. I even bought that idea when I was writing the first book, and I made the mistake of putting it in there. No, that's not where the name came from. It came from Maurice Matthews, who in his day book said that the natives call it onk-onk because of the abundance of geese and other waterfowl. And he couldn't spell onk-onk. And I had fun out because the mayor there in Goose Creek, and I made that the name of some of the streets and subdivisions, onk-onk. I didn't tell him, and don't you tell him either. That stays in here. Right? Yes, ma'am.
What happened if they didn't have any sons at all? The family?
I don't want you to confuse my theory, okay? I don't know. Oh, you go to the second son. Oh, you had no sons at all?
No sons.
It would go back to the king, and the king would just dole it out again through the governor.
Wow.
But you know what? I don't know of that circumstance, but I don't know of any women that took over the rights. And you know what? I was asked to write some stuff for a grant, and the guy that overseeing the grant from the state over in Columbia there, he says you make sure you have slaves in there, and you talk all about it, and make sure you have women in there, and you talk about it. Otherwise, he said you're not going to make any money. So I'm going back and rewriting on this subject. I won't get into all the subject, but taking the woman's point of view, and it's fascinating. The woman's point of view and the slave's point of view is fascinating. If you write or research something and don't think about the man all the time. Because we are a male culture, aren't we? And our history is all built around the man. Try to take that out of your writing and you'll be thinking differently. I don't know why I said that. Yes, ma'am.
What is the time period of the Goose Creek Men from start to when they no longer had the power and influence they had?
They were in power for 50 years, from 1670, from the time the first guy got off that first ship from Barbados, for 50 years, and that was about 1729, is in my head. And that's when the dissenters started taking over the church, because the church was really a political institution, and the dissenters started to take over the authority in the church, and they started going other places. They went into North Carolina that I mentioned with his he divided his plantation into 5, and went into Georgia. And when I was researching the North Carolina part of it is when I stumbled across the truth about Blackbeard the pirate. Where was Blackbeard born? Did anybody know? Where did he do his evil deeds? How old was he when he died? See, when I was a little boy, I thought he had a peg leg and a bad eye. You know, yeah, all the pirates looked alike. When I got to be older, I thought that he was born in England because that's what William Johnson wrote in his book about the pirates. His name was Edward Teach, and he was from England. Well, a guy wrote a book called his name is Dreyfus. Kevin Dreyfus is his name. He wrote a book, The Last Days of Blackbeard the Pirate. Some of y'all might have heard. And I read his book, and I really liked it, and I heard he was going to speak, so I went down to the Charleston. I listened to him speak one night and bought a book, and I read it on the way out and looked at it and said, to my new friend Mike, mayor of Blackbeard's birthplace. That's what I did right there. Show everybody. That's right. That's what I did too. I went back. I said, what do you mean? he said, well, I don't know, Mike. He said, I don't know, but he said, I just feel like he was born in Goose Creek. I just can't get that out of my head. And I said, well, I said, I've researched 83 plantations in Goose Creek, and I've never come across the Beard family. He said, his name wasn't Beard. I'm sorry. He said, I said, I've never seen a teacher attached family. He said, that's not his name. His last name was Beard. I said, my gosh, I got a whole file on Beard. I couldn't wait to get back home and go through and start putting the Beard story together. Blackbeard was pirate was born, you know where Fox Bank is on the way to Monk's Corner? He was born there. He ended up being a pirate for 22 months, and he lived to be 28 years old. And his father was appointed, did I know him? Who said that? I got a book for you too. Anyway, I know I've gone too long, but that's really been the most exciting thing as far as history in the last several years, to find out the truth about Blackbeard. His father, James Moore, I went back, and every time I saw James Moore was Blackbeard's father. His older brother was James Moore. I tell you where he died and how they did it. And James Moore called James Beard, thank you, called him a freebooter. He wrote it in his notes, he's a freebooter. I did the same thing. I went, what's that? I went home and I Googled it. A freebooter is an archaic word that means pirate. His father was a pirate too. Isn't that interesting? Anyway, pretty cool stuff. Thank you for being so nice. I'm used to talking to high school kids. I'm just kidding.
We're gonna be viable. We'd like to be viable.
Okay, you can, well, I've published 5 books, 18 booklets, like magazines that on one subject or another. I got some in my car, I can bring them in. I'm rich because I'm a retired school principal, so you know how so I don't need the money. I can go out and get some more, and you can get them at City Hall, you can get them at the community center. Type Heitzler into the internet, type Heitzler in, and the books come up. And the Berkeley County Tourism, they have my small books are in there where you can even download them or read them right online. They got them. Just put in Heitzler, because there's not very many Heitzlers. Put in Goose Creek, and my books come up. And I have 5 books that have been published, and book size, and I think I have 18 like magazines, and I put up 23 historic markers. So I'm kind of a nerd guy.
Are you from Goose Creek originally?
No, ma'am. I was born in the back seat of a car with no radio and no air conditioning. My dad was in the Marine Corps, and every 2 years we would drive somewhere else. So I got my education looking out the window, watching the world go by, and we didn't stop for anything. And I remember Dad said this. Dad said the Grand Canyon's right there, and we always, where? He said, oh, it's about 300 miles that way. It's a family joke, but he wouldn't stop for nothing. Anyway, I'm going to go out to my car. I can bring in more books, and I can sell them to you for. If I said you're going to have a book, come over and say, give me my book. Otherwise, you can buy them. I'm going to go get some more. Oh, $20 a book. They're over here.
Thank you.